Hello everyone and welcome to the next video. This one is specifically about defining the difference between being optimally healthy, just not being sick, and then in a state of disease. You know, when you really think about it, every moment of every day, every heartbeat, our bodies strive to be optimally healthy. It's the reason why we have all the systems of our body, you know, the circulatory system, the endocrine system, and just everything else. Every bit of it is supposed to work together to make us optimally healthy. So if we're not in a state of optimum health, we really need to understand why that is. In other words, if we're in a state of optimum health, you know, why is it? What contributed to that state? Or what are you not doing that contributed to that state? And conversely, if we're in a state of disease or we're really in a bad spot, we need to understand what contributed to that being, us being in a bad spot, or what are we not doing that contributed to that being in that spot. In the middle, we've got this area where we're not, you know, in a state of disease, but we're not really optimally healthy. We're just kind of in the middle. We're just not sick. And that's really a dangerous place to be. But before we get into that, let's define these three things a little bit more concretely. On one side, being optimally healthy sounds pretty obvious, right? We feel amazing. We've got lots of energy levels. We're doing things. We're outside experiencing nature, for example. We might walk and run. We might do things that help us to get that energy out because we've got so much energy. So you've got little to no ailments of any kind, or annoyances of any kind that might slow you down related to your health. And you're not taking any medications. You're not overweight. You're just feeling great. You're in a good spot. That's pretty obvious. The other obvious spot as well is being on the flip side, being in a state of disease. If we're in a state of disease, we certainly know it. You know, where we're seeking help. We don't know what to do. We don't know why it happened to us. We're in a bad spot at that point, and we're trying to make efforts to fix it. But these two are the two extremes, but I think so many people fall into the middle, which is just not being sick. This is the most dangerous place we can possibly be. And the reason is because since we're not really sick, we're not making any outward efforts to try to become optimally healthy because we're just doing okay somewhere in the middle. Well, whenever we're in that state, we've got ailments, annoyances that might come with daily life that we would chalk up as being normal, just a normal thing that we deal with all the time. It's not a big deal. It'll go away, and we push it aside and think of it as just a normal part of daily life. And one last thing I'll say too about being in a state of just not being sick and the danger of being there is that when we're in that state, we have a tendency to wait until something really goes wrong that puts us in a state of disease before we actually act and do something about our health. And by that time, it's a little bit too late. Okay, so now that we've taken a few minutes to define the difference between optimum health, disease, and just being in a state of not sick, we really need to spend a few minutes taking the time to understand what contributes to our state of health. The big takeaway from this section is simply this: we cannot look at our state of health, whether it's good or bad or somewhere in the middle, outside of the context of environment. We cannot look at our health in complete isolation because our health and our bodies require so many things in our environment in order to be healthy. Inside of that, there's so many variables, and it's going to be different and subjective to each one of us. So let's go through some of the things that in our environment that contribute or detract from optimum health. And the first thing I'd like to talk about are just the general environmental factors to consider. Things like food and nutrition, water, your access to sunlight, getting outside and getting into nature, even our psychological stance and our psychological being has an influence in how healthy or not we are. And there's also things that are bad for us that we are being exposed to, things like electromagnetic radiation, radiation from cell phone towers, for example, or toxins in our food and water. All of these things in our environment contribute to whether or not we are optimally healthy or not. So I'd like to break this down into 3 separate categories for us to consider when we're talking about the environment and how it affects us in our health. The first is nutrition, food and water. The second is going to be carcinogens and toxins. And then the third thing is going to be our general environment, the things that are around us, our habitat, in other words. So let's start with food and nutrition first. This includes things like vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates and proteins, healthy fats or not so healthy fats, water, things that might be in our water that are not necessarily good for us. All of these things fall into the category of nutrition. So then in the second category, we're talking about toxins and carcinogens. So obviously as we take in nutrition, we might also be taking in things that are not necessarily good for us. Some examples could be pesticides and herbicides and other synthetic chemicals that help to ripen fruits and vegetables. Again, electromagnetic radiation. It could be toxins in our water like pharmaceutical runoff and petrochemical runoff that our water systems are unable to totally filter out from our tap water, which is very destructive to our hormones and lots of other systems in our body. And then we have our general environment. And in our general environment, we're going to get good things and we're going to get bad things. But like, for example, sunlight, for example, is very beneficial. I mean, we are human beings, we're animals, we're just another species on this planet. And being that we do live on the surface of a planet, we are supposed to be outside and we are supposed to get into the sun. We get vitamin D from that and lots of other benefits as well. But obviously we don't want too much sun because we could get sunburns and things along those lines. So we have to balance how much of the good and the bad that we're getting from our environment. I mean, we also need, a generally clean environment. Do we have access to clean air? Do we have access to nature to be able to get outside and experience something other than, the city streets if you live in the city? Some other factors to consider too is a good social structure. How happy or unhappy are you in your general social structure? And that obviously has a component to being able to contribute to our optimum health. A couple more things to consider too is sleep and rest and our level of stress. So these two things also work together to contribute to our overall health and have to be considered as well. And again, there's so many variables in our lifestyles from person to person that all of these factors are going to be variable. But those are the overall environmental components that can contribute to or detract from optimum health. So the next thing that we want to consider too when we're talking about these environmental factors is the amount of, say, nutrition or carcinogens that we're getting through our environment. For example, drinking pure water is definitely good for us, but certainly if I asked you to drink a gallon of it right now at this very moment, that could actually kill you. So we have to have the right amounts of water and nutrition for us to be optimally healthy. Certainly, for those among us that are very physically active, that are, like in my case, we're mountain biking and burning 2,000 calories in a ride sometimes, our nutritional intake is going to be different than somebody who is not as active, of course. At the end of the day, we each need to find the optimal balance of nutrition for each one of us. Helping to get those dialed in is what the next videos and the subsequent videos coming after this one is going to be all about. And it's going to give us all a baseline to help contribute to getting that dialed in for each one of us as individuals. As far as toxins and carcinogens, obviously the FDA, for example, has certain levels of bad things that they say that we can have without having any health effects. Like they might say that, certain chemicals in our water, can be up to a certain, part per million, for example. But, I'd like to say that I think 0 toxins should be in our water and in our food. For example, GMOs and toxic pesticides and synthetic pesticides are certainly not good for us. So if we eat the right foods, for example, like, lots of fruits and vegetables, but we're also taking in these carcinogens and these chemicals, even in trace amounts. They can be very destructive to our health and not necessarily contribute to our optimum health, even though we believe that it is. And so this is where we really start to dial in the fact of balancing nutrition to potential toxins. There's some other things to consider too, like, bioaccumulation of toxins that, whenever you get just a little bit of the toxin, doesn't hurt you acutely, but over time can bioaccumulate. And a perfect example of this, and we're going to be going over this in a subsequent video here, is fluoridized water. So we have fluoride in the water, which I'm sorry to say, you don't need it for your teeth, and it's not a nutrient. It doesn't do anything for our health, and it does bioaccumulate over time. It is a neurotoxic chemical. It's bad for us, and so we don't want that building up in our systems. That's an example of a bioaccumulation of something that's bad, that you're constantly and chronically being exposed to, that you don't even know that you're getting. Of course, the best case that we can be in with all of this is zero. We don't want any toxins in our environment. And we're going to get into this in subsequent videos, but organizations might come out and say, well, you can have a little bit of this terribly toxic chemical in your water or in your food, and you'll be fine. Like, for example, like in GMO foods, a genetically modified organism is what GMO stands for. We'll get into that later. But GMO foods, for example, have trace amounts of herbicides and pesticides and petrochemical-based fertilizers, and those make their way into the food, and you get just a little bit of that every time you eat it. That's one of those things that can bioaccumulate that they say you can have a little bit of, and that's okay. But let me put this into perspective. Let's say, for example, I invited you over for dinner. You came over to my house, I cooked you up a beautiful looking meal, and then I told you before we sat down to eat that, hey, I just want you to know, I put just a little bit of rat poison in your dinner, but don't worry, the FDA says that you can have just a little bit of it and it won't be bad for you. Would you still eat it? Because I wouldn't. I mean, that's an extreme example, but that is exactly the same thing that we're being told about our foods. Hey, we're putting toxic, deadly chemicals on your food. We're putting it in your water. It's in your water. We can't clean it out, but the FDA and other organizations say, perfectly okay, you can have it, as long as it's not too much. And we're going to go over this again in some future videos. Maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm passionate about this. Whenever we get to a certain point where that chemical is, the FDA might say, well, you can't have certain, any more than a certain number of parts per million of this chemical. And then the water supplies start to get more and more of this chemical. The FDA will just raise the limit, so they can continue to say that the water is safe. And so we just keep getting more and more and more of these chemicals. And if we're not taking the time to educate ourselves to figure out that we're being exposed to these things, then it's going to be very, very difficult to understand why we're having health problems, even though we think we're doing the right things. Don't worry, we're going to be getting into all these things in future videos. And then finally, for the general environment type things, we want to make sure that we're getting a good balance of things in our environment that contribute to health. In other words, and I've said it before, we want to get out in nature, go for hikes, go for mountain bike rides, just get outside in the sunlight and enjoy yourself as much as you can. Those things are good for you, and they definitely do contribute to your optimum health. And again, this is all about balance. We want to make sure that we're getting the right balance of everything. So in conclusion, as we start to move forward with additional information on laying a new foundation of knowledge to support optimum health and to feed our OODA loops with brand new information so we can make new decisions and have new outcomes. One of the things that we need to consider with this section is taking a look at our environment, our general environment, everything from our food and our water to our psychological and stress levels, how much sleep we're getting. All of these things work together to influence optimum health. evaluate some of those things and start to think about what it is that you can start to change to improve your overall environment. Eat clean foods, get clean water, get a purification system if you don't already have one. Get outside, enjoy yourself, move around, be physically active if you can be. All of those things contribute. And again, in the videos to come, we're going to be talking about GMO foods versus conventional. We're going to be talking about organic grass-fed meats versus conventional. We're going to be talking about tap water contaminants and how to purify your water. All of these things are going to be coming up in future videos to help lay a foundation so that we can become optimally healthy and not get into that rut of just not being sick somewhere in the middle. And of course, we definitely don't want to be in a state of disease. So thanks a lot. We'll see you at the next video.